Hello everyone and welcome to Government 340. Today we're going to be talking about gender in Central Asia. And this is a topic that we've discussed a bit in past lectures, particularly when we talked about religion in Central Asia and in how different economic developments have affected certain forms of customary governance and regional practices and traditions. But today we're going to be diving into this topic with a little bit more detail. And we're not just going to be looking at the role of women in Central Asia, we're going to be looking at the gender roles prescribed to both men and women in the region and how those have varied across time. So first, before I begin this discussion, we have to clarify some of the differences between gender and sex. So sex denotes biology. So this is a person's reproductive system, their secondary sex characteristics, and it does not actually inherently carry any social or cultural elements on its own. These are merely physical characteristics that a person has. Gender, on the other hand, is a sociocultural practice that is learned, and it's a set of practices that essentially tell one how they should behave based on their sex. Children typically observe their parents, and the impact of gender roles is even more salient when people live homosocial lives. So these are when their social environments are segregated by gender. So if you primarily only interact with women, if you are a woman, or if you only interact with men, if you are a man, then you're leading a homosocial life. And there are certain environments and certain cultures that are more homosocial than others, especially in cultures that have practices of female seclusion. These are much more common. And gender is typically portrayed as a dichotomy, so between male and female. Sex is also portrayed within this dichotomy, but the focus on a dichotomy is inaccurate for both sex and gender. So people may be hermaphrodites, so they have both sexes' reproductive systems, and for gender there are non-binary individuals, and this is not new. So European culture stressed the gender and sex binary, and there's a very strong biblical influence on this. But even in Central Asia, despite looking at it now as being one that follows more traditional gender roles and places more restrictions on the potential political and economic avenues for women, they did not traditionally have this kind of European binary with regards to genders. But the lack of a gender binary was typically portrayed as immoral by Russians, which follows a very salient trend among European colonizers to condemn practices that were not typically seen in Europe at the time. And we see gender being a means by which cultural and political values can be expressed. And there are numerous factors that have an influence over this, whether it be the state, colonial powers, religion, family structure, traditions. All of these have an impact on how gender is expressed and how gender practices are played out, and the strictness with which one must follow those. And once again, these do vary over time. Looking at gender roles, this is how one's gender is performed in a social setting. So this is a social role prescribed on the basis of gender that assigns acceptable, appropriate, and desirable behavior for both men and women. And it's generally used to downplay similarities between genders and exaggerate the differences. So it's used to create as much space as possible between the two genders. And this can extend to things like careers. So it's not just something that impacts how we view people who are performing a certain gender, but it also opens and closes some potential avenues. For example, looking at the United States and Europe, if you have a job like being a maid or nurse or secretary or even a grade school teacher, you're more than likely a woman. If you are a doctor, a lawyer, even a professor or an engineer, stockbrokers, construction workers, first responders, these are typically jobs held by men. It's not that this is a universal type of thing, it's just general trends that we see within careers because of how those careers are viewed and how the expression of gender roles plays out in those fields. So if you view women as being traditional kind of homemakers, you might see them more likely to be maids filling out those types of roles for other individuals, or women are seen as more caring, so they would fill in that nurse role. And these have very broad implications, and they're not followed 100%. So it's very difficult to generalize a lot of these assumptions, but there are trends that we see with the jobs that individuals hold or their lack of employment with regards to women. And in Central Asia, we especially see this difference between the role of a homemaker and a provider. So women are typically responsible for the home, and this oftentimes prevents them from entering the labor market, and child rearing is their key role. So if a woman can't have children, that severely restricts their ability to carry out their gender role. And this impacts fathers as well. So it downplays their role within the family and reduces them to primarily a disciplinary role. And this stress on keeping women in the home and out of the workforce places more pressure on men, especially when there's an economic downturn, for them to be able to provide for their family without a secondary income. There are additionally numerous problems with analyzing gender. So it's something that is very difficult to generalize individual experiences. So at different levels, be that individual, national, regional, global, gender is experienced differently, and there are different trends on each of those levels. But we can, in general, attempt to try to find major trends that are in each of those categories. And even within Central Asia, we can see that individuals have very different experiences. So they could be from more liberal or more conservative families, and this can have a very big impact on gender roles. But women are still dependent on their families for their social situation. And so there's still very little choice or agency given to women, much like what we saw with the article that we read earlier this semester on unveiling. This was a Soviet policy that was primarily portrayed as an effort at women's liberation, but the decision on whether or not to unveil was made by husbands, and husbands would decide whether or not they would unveil their wives. It was not a decision left up to the women themselves. And for this week, we read an article that focused on the relationship between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. And the author of this piece, McBrien, explains that the mother-in-law believed that her treatment was almost too lenient, and that the daughter-in-law should have been appreciative of the fact that she did not expect much of her, and that she gave her so much freedom that she didn't have to give her daughter-in-law, and really was not expected to give her. But in return, she received very little, in that her daughter-in-law spent a lot of time with her family and refused to move back into her mother-in-law's house with her new child. And this is despite her kind of carrying out the traditional overbearing disciplinary role of mother-in-laws. But once again, the daughter-in-law is still subject to the whims of the mother-in-law, where the mother-in-law could have perhaps demanded that she come back. We didn't see that occurring between these two women, but it was a source of bitterness on both their parts, that neither of them could live their lives the way that they wished. We also see different national experiences. So the state has an interest in certain goals with regards towards the expression of gender roles. So there can be a reproduction of national identity through the continuation of traditional practices, especially as these practices are being revived in the post-Soviet era. The state may place a lot of emphasis on traditional gender practices to kind of restart the state pride and nationalism that they wish to foster in the state. Additionally, we see the state encouraging traditional gender roles to encourage higher birth rates. So there's sometimes tax breaks that are given to new mothers, maternity leave, and the like that are meant to increase birth rates. And we saw this of being in particular importance in Kazakhstan among the ethnic Kazakh population because they did not represent an absolute majority of the population in Kazakhstan. So the government has an interest in having that population grow. And as a result, they have policies that are meant to kind of reinforce the traditional homemaker role that women play out in order for them to have more children. And across Central Asia, we see a lot of similar policies. So the region has some peculiarities that are unique to Central Asia. Part of this is the influence of Islam. Part of it is that these 5 countries share a lot of similarities in that they were under Russian and Soviet rule for as long as they were. And this has created a kind of combination of later period Soviet policies with kind of the revival of traditional practices that were repressed during the Soviet era, along with, in some states, an effort to westernize. So we see this in particular Kazakhstan and in some cases in Kyrgyzstan, where there is a pressure to modernize and westernize. But we also see authoritarian regimes interested in reproducing gender roles. And this isn't for the purposes of westernizing necessarily, but kind of the enforcement of the patriarchy on the familial level can serve to reinforce patriarchal or paternal roles for the president or the autocrat. So as the father is the head of the home, the president is the father of the state. And there is a reproduction of those kinds of familial traditional policies that are present on the family and local level by the state as a means to enforce their rule. And we also see different global experiences. So there are different trends across the globe with regards to how gender rights should be expressed on women's rights, on the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. And while these are not typically discussed with regards to Central Asia, they have all been gaining traction in recent years, and it's something that you can't not talk about with regards to the region or the world. Gender and expression of gender and the roles prescribed to members of different groups have changed over time. So in the pre-colonial era, you had elements of modern gender roles, but the dichotomy between men and women was perhaps less stark. So the prescription of emotionality and tenderness and care for the family was not something that was solely prescribed to women or coded as feminine in pre-colonial Central Asian societies. But especially among nomadic groups, we see that gender roles in pre-colonial Central Asia, their gender roles were less regimented than what happens as they are colonialized, and we see this policy of Russianization. So European values came with Russian colonialism, and this changed what expressions of gender were acceptable, and there was a slow extermination of practices that were deemed deviant by European standards. And there is this overlap between Europeanization and Russianization in the policies that were pursued. We also see Soviet policies being even more influential than those of the Russian Empire. The Soviets were more invested in the development of Central Asia, and so therefore spent more time stressing certain policies. And we see women's liberation being a marker of modernization and of devotion to communism, but there is still this overvaluing of ethnic Russians versus the Central Asian population. So regardless of what policies they pursued, they were generally viewed as more backwards than the parts of the Soviet Union that were located in Europe. And there were numerous alternative motives for the Soviet Union, whether this be generating legibility among a population that they didn't understand, or as a means by which to kind of generate a national identity that was approved by the Soviet Union, and we very much see the reproduction of gender roles, especially those related to the family under the Soviet Union, and by reinforcing familial norms, they were trying to recreate or generate a national identity. Whether this be for the titular ethnic identity within the republic that they lived in or for the greater Soviet Union. So we see an intense level of politicization of gender. We also see increasing criminalization and pathologization of any, once again, deviant behavior by Soviet standards. So whether this be divorce in some cases being a sign that one was unfit, or being a member of an LGBTQ plus community or something similar, all of these were deemed to make one ill and also could carry prison sentences. And we've seen elements of this carry on into the modern era as well, where there's been little advancement in the way of rights for these communities in Central Asia. And once again, during the Soviet era, there was a preference for European, in this case being Russian, behavior. And Russian behavior was still very much influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy, and this was kind of informing the moral views of the leadership of the Soviet Union, even if religion was meant to be something that eventually withered away and was discriminated against itself. In modern gender politics, we see many holdovers from the Soviet period. So they kept the gender dichotomy and gender roles. We haven't seen a return of any non-binary groups that are viewed to be at an equal level to men or women. And there's no real push to bring those groups back. They continue to criminalize same-sex relationships and continue to discriminate against divorced women and fatherless children. So this can lead to disadvantaged social positions and fewer economic and political opportunities. We also see many Central Asian states continue to stress motherhood and reproduction. So there's tax breaks for childbirth, maternity leave, a lot of encouragement for women to leave the workforce after giving birth. And once again, men are precluded from holding the same child-rearing role that is given to women in this case. And much like how the Soviet Union politicized gender roles to produce a national identity, gender roles here are very much meant to reproduce national values and therefore encourage greater nationalism. However, there is a certain dissonance that is produced by the prevalence of migrant labor, and this has been a recurring theme throughout this class, is the role that migrant labor has played in Central Asia and its political developments after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in the case of gender roles, young men are more likely to leave than any other group in search of labor in other countries. And this means that gender roles cannot be carried out because the main provider is not at home. While men still provide, the distance means that women have greater autonomy at home, or at the very least, women must make more decisions about home life and the lives of their children than if men were home. So especially in kind of these local and customary forms of governance that we've discussed earlier in the semester, women are increasingly taking over leadership positions because the men who would fill those positions are not there. And as a result, we see women in Central Asia holding more political power, especially on that local level, even if it's not reproduced on the national level, than they have held in the past. So even during the colonial period and during the Soviet Union, despite the Soviets' pushes towards gender equality or women's liberation, the absence of men in rural areas now in Central Asia has given women a lot more autonomy to pursue avenues of political power, even if that's not a choice that they would have made for themselves if men were home. We also see gender roles being used to generate family values, and these can be held by a single family, but oftentimes there are certain family values that are produced over a larger group of individuals. So whether this be a clan or a group of families or a village or a muhala or a lineage or even an ethnic group or even a state, we see family values being used as a means to kind of judge others. But we also see family values being a means of risk management. So many use their family to offset uncertainty in the post-Soviet era. Presently, there is an incredibly unstable economic environment in Central Asia, and even if it's more politically stable now, it's difficult to have any degree of economic certainty, especially for those in rural areas. And very quickly, entire fields can be lost due to advancements in technology or due to a lack of investment. So, for example, wood carving was a large field in Central Asia under the Russian Empire, but it fell out of practice during the Soviet period because there was no demand for wood carvers to be carving the pillars on mosques or in the construction of kind of the pre-Soviet style building projects. So if you had trained to be a wood carver, that job was simply gone. Additionally, we see problems with farming. So in rural areas, after ecological disasters or regional droughts, we see farming no longer being a guaranteed means of income. So oftentimes we see individuals using their siblings to offset the risks imposed by the fact that entire sectors of the economy can disappear relatively quickly. So siblings tend to enter into different fields, whether this be farming, migrant labor, entrepreneurship, higher education, or the like, so that if one sector is hit, the other siblings are still able to provide for their family. Oddly enough, this produces competing desires. So the state wants families to have children, and if you have more children, then those siblings can enter into different markets and the family can be more secure. But raising more children is more expensive. So we actually see the size of families in a lot of Central Asian states trending downwards, which throws into question whether or not this risk management strategy is going to work in the future when people are having fewer children. And once again, divorce and single motherhood remains highly stigmatized because it breaks with family norms and kind of deviates from these family values. And it can be a source of shame both for the women and for their families. It can also limit job opportunities. So in one of our articles, it spoke about how a woman could not be a school teacher after she was divorced during the Soviet period because it would set a bad example for a divorced woman to be a school teacher for the children. And women for this are not necessarily punished by the law, but they can be punished by society and kind of social stigma and shame. And men can remarry, but it's much more difficult for women to do so. Additionally, looking at marriage, it can be much more traumatic for women than it is for their husbands, because they are often forced to leave their family and their homes. And even if they're allowed to visit back, they no longer live with their family. And they're forced to conform to their mother-in-law's rules and preferences and standards. And mother-in-laws tend to have a tremendous amount of power over new wives in directing their behavior and their lives and their responsibilities. And women who are new to a family are often placed in a position of powerlessness. And this can encourage some women to seek a divorce in order to escape that situation. But it is shameful to divorce and shameful to visit your own family for too long. And this use of shame is meant to constrain the level of autonomy and the actions that women can undertake. But this doesn't mean that this type of responsibility is solely on the daughter-in-law's shoulders. The behavior of daughter-in-laws reflects on the mother-in-law. So there is a pressure for mother-in-laws to police the behavior of their daughter-in-laws, because if they don't, then they themselves are shamed for their actions. This doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. A lot of the problems stem from the fact that this is a non-consensual power dynamic between new wives who are put in an unfamiliar situation, in an unfamiliar environment where they're separated from their previous social network and largely left to the whims of their new family. And this can be highly stressful and highly traumatizing, and very much depends on their husbands and on their mother-in-laws and on their fathers-in-laws for how that transition happens. And because new wives are subordinate to all family members older than them, it can be difficult to exist, find one's feet, and, build a home when you're a newlywed. So in conclusion, keep in mind that sex and gender are not the same, and gender